The summer of 1983 in Cheyenne, Illinois, started like any other. Long, lazy days where the most exciting thing on my police blotter was breaking up teenage parties or writing speeding tickets. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and the biggest news was whether the high school football team would make state that year. I'd been with the Cheyenne Police Department for 12 years by then. Enough time to know every street, every alley, every shortcut in our little corner of Will County. The population barely scraped 3,000, and most days that felt like about 2,992 many people to keep track of. I was living the definition of small-town law enforcement: mundane, predictable, safe. The day Tommy Hargrave went missing started ordinarily enough. His mother, Margaret, came into the station around noon, wringing her hands and fighting back tears. Tommy hadn't come home the night before. No call, no note, nothing. She'd already checked with his friends, called the school, even driven around town looking for him herself. "He's a good boy, Officer Farnsworth," she kept saying, her voice trembling. "He wouldn't just run off. Something's wrong. I can feel it." I'd heard similar words from dozens of worried parents over the years. Usually, the kid turned up within 24 hours, sheepish and full of excuses about staying at a friend's house or losing track of time. But something about Margaret's fear felt different. More urgent. More real. We took the report, started making calls. Tommy's friends all said the same thing: they'd last seen him heading home after basketball practice. He'd mentioned something about taking a shortcut through the woods near the old quarry. Standard procedure would have been to wait another day, see if he turned up on his own. But Chief Mathers decided to start the search immediately. The first 3 days were frustrating. We combed the woods, checked abandoned buildings, put up posters. Nothing. No signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no footprints. It was like Tommy had simply vanished into thin air. By day 4, the mood in town had shifted. People started locking their doors at night. Parents kept their kids inside. The whispers started: maybe Tommy hadn't just run away. Maybe something had happened to him. Something bad. That's when Chief Mathers called the meeting. All 5 of us crowded into his office: me, Eddie Grisham, our newest recruit, and the other 2 officers. The chief spread a map across his desk, the corners curling up from years of use. "We've covered most of the obvious areas," he said, his finger tracing the familiar grid of Cheyenne streets. "But there's one place we haven't checked thoroughly enough." His finger stopped at the quarry. The old quarry had been abandoned since before I joined the force. A vast pit of broken stone and stagnant water, surrounded by dense woods that had grown wild over decades of neglect. Kids would dare each other to go there at night, but most stayed away. There was something about the place that felt wrong, even in broad daylight. "Lou, you and Eddie take the east side," the chief said. "Follow the tree line down to the water. The rest of us will cover the other approaches. Radio check every 15 minutes. Eddie looked at me, trying to hide his nervousness. He was green, barely 2 years out of the academy, but he had good instincts. I gave him a reassuring nod as we headed out to the patrol car. The drive to the quarry was quiet. Eddie kept checking and rechecking his equipment: flashlight, radio, sidearm. I wanted to tell him it would be routine, just another search that would probably turn up nothing. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way the setting sun cast long shadows across the road, or the unusual stillness in the air. Whatever it was, it kept me silent. We parked at the old access road and started our sweep just as darkness was settling in. The woods seemed different at night, more alive somehow. Our flashlight beams cut through the gloom, creating strange shapes that played tricks on the eyes. "Stay close," I told Eddie. "Easy to get turned around out here after dark." The first hour was uneventful. We found the usual teenage debris: beer cans, cigarette butts, the remains of old campfires. Nothing that pointed to Tommy. But as we moved deeper into the woods, something changed. The normal night sounds, crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals, began to fade away. The silence grew heavier as we approached the quarry's edge. Our boots crunched on loose gravel, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the still air. The beam of my flashlight swept across the abandoned pit, revealing jagged walls of stone that disappeared into darkness below. "Lou," Eddie whispered, his voice tight. "Look at this." He was pointing to something at the edge of the quarry. As I moved closer, my light revealed drag marks in the dirt, leading toward a cluster of dense undergrowth. Whatever had made them was heavy enough to leave deep grooves in the hard-packed earth. We followed the trail carefully, weapons drawn. The brush opened into a small clearing, and that's when we saw it, a torn, blood-stained piece of fabric caught on a low branch. My stomach turned as I recognized the pattern. It matched the description of the shirt Tommy had been wearing when he disappeared. "Call it in," I told Eddie, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the clearing. But before he could reach for his radio, a sound stopped us both cold. It came from somewhere in the darkness below the quarry's edge, a low, wet sound, like something large moving through thick mud. Eddie's flashlight beam jerked toward the noise, revealing a series of depressions in the ground filled with stagnant water. They might have been natural formations, except for one thing: they were arranged in a pattern that was decidedly unnatural. "We should wait for backup," Eddie said, but we both knew we couldn't. If Tommy was down there, every minute could count. The descent into the quarry was treacherous. Loose rocks shifted under our feet, threatening to send us sliding into the darkness below. The air grew colder as we moved down, carrying a smell that made my nose burn, something chemical mixed with the sickly sweet odor of decay. At the bottom, our lights revealed what looked like an entrance to an old mining tunnel. Water trickled from somewhere in the darkness, forming shallow pools that reflected our flashlight beams in strange, distorted patterns. "Tommy?" I called out, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "Tommy Hargrave?" The echo died away, replaced by that wet, sliding sound again, closer now. Eddie's light caught movement at the tunnel's mouth. Something massive shifted in the shadows, something that shouldn't have been able to move so quickly or so silently. I had my gun out before I could think, years of training taking over. "Police! Don't move!" The thing that emerged from the tunnel didn't obey. It didn't even seem to register our presence at first. It was huge, its form seeming to shift and flow like oil in water. In the harsh beam of our flashlights, I could see that what I'd first taken for skin was a patchwork of textures, scales, fur, and something else that looked horrifyingly like human flesh. Eddie made a choking sound beside me. His flashlight beam shook, highlighting different aspects of the creature: multiple limbs that bent at impossible angles, a torso that seemed to ripple and expand, and what might have been a head, split into several parts that opened to reveal rows of gleaming teeth. "Jesus Christ," Eddie whispered. The thing's heads snapped toward us at the sound. There was intelligence in its movement, a predatory awareness that made my blood run cold. I fired 2 rounds into its mass, the gunshots deafening in the enclosed space. The bullets seemed to pass right through it, like shooting at smoke. The creature surged forward with impossible speed. I shoved Eddie hard to one side as a limb longer than a car whipped through the space where we'd been standing. "Run!" I screamed, firing again as I backed away. The creature's flesh rippled where the bullet struck, but it showed no sign of pain or damage. Eddie stumbled to his feet and grabbed for his radio. "Officer down! Officer down! We need immediate backup at the quarry. There's some kind of..." The creature's next attack caught him mid-sentence. A limb like a massive tentacle wrapped around his waist and lifted him into the air. I emptied my magazine into the thing, trying to make it drop him, but it was like shooting at water. Eddie's scream cut through the night as the creature slammed him against the quarry wall. I heard bones crack, but Eddie was still moving, still fighting. I reloaded as fast as my shaking hands would allow, knowing our ammunition was probably useless, but unable to think of any other option. That's when we heard it, the sound of engines and voices from above. Our backup had arrived faster than I'd expected. The creature paused, its multiple heads turning toward the noise. It released Eddie, who crumpled to the ground with a grunt of pain. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness from above, and I heard Chief Mather's voice. "Lou! Eddie! Where are you?" "Down here," I shouted. "Chief, you need heavier weapons. Guns aren't..." The creature moved with explosive force, launching itself up the quarry wall toward the new threads. I could hear shouts of horror and disbelief from above, followed by the thunderous report of shotguns. The thing screamed, a sound that seemed to come from a dozen throats at once, echoing off the quarry walls with such force that loose rocks began to fall around us. I ran to Eddie, who was conscious but badly hurt. "We have to move," I told him, pulling him to his feet. "Can you walk?" He nodded grimly, leaning heavily on my shoulder as we made our way toward a service tunnel I knew led to the upper level. Above us, the firefight continued. The creature's screams mixed with gunfire and the shouts of officers. We emerged from the tunnel just in time to see Chief Mathers empty both barrels of his shotgun into what might have been the creature's central mass. The thing staggered, its form seeming to lose cohesion for a moment. The other officers were firing too, concentrating their fire on the same spot. The creature's flesh began to bubble and split where the shotgun pellets had torn into it. It tried to retreat, but we had it surrounded now. Chief Mathers reloaded and fired again and again. Each blast seemed to take away more of the thing's substance, like watching a nightmare dissolve in morning light. With a final, earth-shaking scream, the creature collapsed. Its form lost all definition, melting into a puddle of something that looked like tar but moved like it was alive. Even that movement gradually slowed and stopped. "Nobody touches it," Chief Mathers ordered, though none of us needed telling. "Lou, where's Tommy?" I pointed toward the tunnel entrance. "If he's here, he's down there." We found Tommy's body in one of the deeper pools. The water was thick with the same black substance that the creature had become, but we could see enough to know he'd been dead for days. The official cause of death would later be listed as drowning, but we all knew that wasn't the whole truth. The aftermath was a blur of activity. State police arrived, then federal agents who said they were from the EPA but carried themselves like military. They cordoned off the quarry, took our statements, and collected what remained of the creature in special containers. We were told not to talk about what we'd seen. The official story would be that Tommy had fallen into the quarry while exploring and drowned. Any mention of the creature would be attributed to stress and poor visibility. Eddie's injuries were blamed on a fall during the search. But we knew what we'd seen. In the years that followed, I would sometimes wake in the night, drenched in sweat, remembering the way that thing had moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the wrongness of its very existence. Eddie transferred to another department 6 months later. Can't say I blamed him. The quarry was filled in the following year. Official reason was safety concerns, but those of us who were there that night knew better. Sometimes I drive past it late at night, when the moon is full and the shadows are long. The ground has been leveled, trees planted, nature reclaiming what was once an open wound in the earth. But every now and then, I hear stories. Hunters finding strange tracks in the woods. Animals acting peculiar. Sounds in the night that don't quite fit any known creature. And I wonder if maybe we didn't kill it after all. Maybe we just drove it deeper underground, where it waits, growing stronger, biding its time. I've been with the Channahon Police Department for 30 years now. Most days are still filled with routine calls and minor incidents. But sometimes, when a missing persons report comes across my desk, I feel that old fear creep back. I look at the map, at the woods that stretch beyond our town's borders, and I wonder what else might be out there, hiding in the dark places where civilization fears to tread. Because now I know the truth, that in small towns like Channahon, where nothing ever happens, sometimes the nothing is hiding something far worse. Something that defies explanation, something that reminds us that we're not at the top of the food chain after all. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear it screaming. Spring came late to the Cascades in 1996. The mountains held onto winter like a jealous lover, refusing to let go until forced by the warming currents from the Pacific. I remember the year vividly, not for the unusual weather, but for what happened during those fateful days in April. Some memories burn themselves into your mind, leaving scars deeper than any physical wound. This is one of those stories. I'd been a ranger in these parts for 15 years by then. The Cascade Mountains were more than just my patrol area, they were my ancestral home. The Quinault tribe had lived in these forests for countless generations, and our stories spoke of both the beauty and the dangers that dwelled within them. My grandfather used to tell me tales of strange creatures that lived in the deepest parts of the woods, places where the shadows grew thick and the ancient trees whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Back then, I dismissed those stories as legends meant to keep children from wandering too far. Now, I know better. That spring morning started with an unusual stillness. The fog hung low between the trees, turning the forest into a maze of ghostly silhouettes. I remember checking my equipment twice, something I rarely did after years of routine. My radio, GPS unit, first aid kit, hunting knife, and the old .30-06 rifle I carried for emergencies. Something in my gut told me I'd need them all before the day was done. The first sign that something was wrong came at 7:30 a.m. Sarah Martinez, one of our newer rangers, radioed in about finding strange tracks near the eastern ridge. Not bear, not cougar, something she couldn't identify. I still have the photos she sent to the station, massive prints, nearly 18 inches long, with distinct claw marks that dragged through the soil. The stride length was impossible, over 6 feet between prints. Whatever made them was huge, and it was moving fast. By 9 a.m., the calls started coming in. 3 separate hiking groups reported missing equipment from their campsites. Not the usual bear raids we were used to, these were selective. Backpacks containing food were left untouched, but anything with a strong artificial scent was gone: deodorant, toothpaste, soap. One camper reported their entire medical kit had vanished. The strange part? No tracks around the tents, no torn fabric, no signs of forced entry. It was as if the items had simply disappeared. I was checking one of these sites when I got the call about the missing couple, Tom and Lisa Reeves, both experienced hikers in their late 20s. They'd registered at the station 2 days prior, planning a week-long trek along the ridge. Their emergency beacon had activated briefly at 8:43 a.m., then went dead. The last signal came from a section of the park we called the Dead Zone, a remote area where the trees grew so thick they blocked out most sunlight and radio signals struggled to penetrate. The air grew colder as I approached their last known location. The forest had fallen silent, no birdsong, no rustling in the undergrowth, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of dead leaves under my boots. Their campsite looked wrong from the moment I spotted it. The tent wasn't just torn, it was methodically shredded, as if something had been studying its construction. Their belongings weren't scattered in panic, they were arranged in neat piles, separated by type. Clothes in one pile, electronics in another, food in a third. The tracks around the site told a story that made my blood run cold. 2 sets of human prints running from the tent. Then larger prints, the same ones Sarah had photographed, moving with purpose, not chase. The creature had herded them, driving them deeper into the woods with calculated precision. I found Lisa's camera near the tent, its memory card intact. The last photo was taken at 8:41 a.m., 2 minutes before their beacon activated. It showed Tom standing at the edge of their campsite, looking up at something in the trees. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. Following their trail, I found more evidence of intelligence in our pursuer. Broken branches had been woven together to block obvious escape routes. Small rock slides had been triggered to cut off paths back to civilization. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct, this was a hunter that understood its prey's thinking patterns. The temperature dropped further as I entered a clearing I'd never seen before, despite my years in these woods. The ground was different here, darker, almost black, and nothing grew in perfect circles scattered across the area. The stench hit me first, a mixture of decay and something chemical, like burning plastic. That's why I saw the bones. Hundreds of them, clean and sorted by size. Some were obviously animal remains, but others were unmistakably human. The attack came from above. In all my years of tracking and hunting, nothing had ever gotten the drop on me like that. One moment I was alone, the next I was fighting for my life against something that shouldn't exist. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall when standing upright, but it moved with an unnatural fluidity, as if its joints worked in ways that defied anatomy. Its fur was patchy, revealing gray skin underneath that looked almost metallic in the dim light. But its face, that's what haunts my dreams even now. It wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. Its eyes held intelligence, curiosity, and most terrifyingly, purpose. The fight was brief but brutal. My knife connected several times, but its hide was tough, almost armored. Its claws raked across my chest, leaving deep gashes that would later require 43 stitches. The creature was testing me, learning my movements, adapting its attacks. When I ran, it pursued not with the raw aggression of a predator, but with the calculated patience of something that knew it had the advantage. The ravine probably saved my life. Not because it stopped the creature, I later found evidence it could have easily jumped the gap, but because it chose not to. It watched me from across the divide, its head tilted in an almost human expression of curiosity. Then it did something I'll never forget. It smiled. Not a predator's snarl, but a deliberate showing of teeth that conveyed a clear message: next time. I made it to the old ranger cabin just as the sun was setting. The structure was abandoned in the 70s after several unexplained disappearances in the area. I barricaded myself inside, using the emergency first aid kit to patch my wounds as best I could. The next few hours were psychological warfare. The creature circled the cabin, mimicking human voices, calling for help in what sounded like Tom's voice, then Lisa's, then in voices I didn't recognize. It was learning, adapting, hunting not just our bodies, but studying our behaviors. The final confrontation was inevitable. When it crashed through the window, I was ready with the old axe I'd found mounted on the cabin wall. The blade was rusty, but the handle was worn smooth from years of use. The fight was different this time. The creature was more aggressive, more desperate. It had realized I was different from its usual prey. When the axe finally found its mark, burying itself deep in the creature's skull, the look in its eyes wasn't anger or pain, but something closer to recognition. The rescue team arrived at dawn, drawn by my emergency signals. They documented everything: the creature's body, the boneyard, the methodically destroyed campsite. But by the time a full scientific team arrived 3 days later, the creature's remains had decomposed at an impossible rate, leaving behind only a few tissue samples that proved inconclusive. The official report cited a previously unknown species of bear, driven to unusual behavior by environmental pressures. Tom and Lisa's bodies were found 2 weeks later, halfway up a cliff face that would have been impossible for them to climb on their own. Their bodies showed no signs of violence. They had simply stopped breathing, as if they had fallen asleep in the middle of their apparent escape attempt. The medical examiner found trace amounts of an unknown compound in their blood, but the samples degraded before they could be properly analyzed. I retired from the Ranger Service the following year, but I still live in these mountains. Someone needs to remember, to watch, to warn others when necessary. The official records are sealed, the evidence lost or destroyed, but the forest remembers. And sometimes, on cold spring mornings when the fog rolls in thick between the trees, I swear I can hear something moving in the shadows, watching, waiting, learning. Because the most terrifying truth isn't that monsters exist, it's that they're getting smarter. The stench lingered in my nostrils for days after finding that first body. Anyone who's spent time around death knows each kind has its own signature of rotting vegetation, decaying animals, human remains. This was different. The chemical undertone reminded me of industrial cleaning agents, sharp and artificial, completely out of place in these woods. I documented everything meticulously in my logbook, something I had started during my time in military reconnaissance. Time, temperature, weather conditions, position of the remains. The precision of the wounds bothered me most. Clean cuts through bone and tissue, no tearing or crushing you'd expect from a predator attack. The spacing suggested tools or appendages unlike anything known to inhabit these mountains. Sheriff's Department arrived 4 hours after my radio call. Their investigation followed predictable patterns: photographs, measurements, bagging of evidence. I watched them work, noting how they ignored crucial details: the unusual tracks leading away from the scene, the strange material caught on nearby branches that seemed to shimmer despite the overcast sky. That night, alone in my cabin, I began fortifying my position. Military training teaches you to secure your perimeter first. I installed motion sensors salvaged from abandoned hunting camps, positioning them in concentric circles around the cabin. Simple tripwires connected to tin can alarms covered the obvious approach routes. Inside, I mounted infrared cameras borrowed from my wildlife observation equipment. The following weeks brought more evidence. Game cameras captured bizarre images, distortions that couldn't be explained by equipment malfunction. Strange sounds echoed through the valleys, carrying frequencies that made my teeth ache. Local wildlife behavior changed dramatically. Nocturnal animals became active during daylight hours, while diurnal creatures disappeared entirely. My investigation expanded. Topographical maps covered my walls, marked with sighting locations, track patterns, and inexplicable phenomena. The pattern that emerged suggested intelligence, not just animal instinct, but calculated movements. Whatever this thing was, it was learning our routines, adapting its behavior to avoid detection. Second body appeared in late October, near the old mining trail. Another hunter, but this time the methodology had changed. The dismemberment showed refinement, like something improving its technique through practice. I found traces of a substance nearby, viscous fluid that seemed to eat through organic matter while leaving synthetic materials untouched. Winter came early that year. Heavy snow isolated the region, cutting off easy access to town. Radio communications became spotty, though I couldn't tell if it was weather interference or something else. The thing's activities intensified during storms, using weather conditions to mask its movements. I began sleeping in 4-hour shifts, maintaining constant surveillance. My military experience taught me about sleep deprivation, how to function on minimal rest while staying alert. During daylight hours, I tracked it systematically, mapping its territory. The creature seemed to establish a pattern, concentric circles expanding outward from what I presumed was its central location. By December, I identified several possible den sites. Deep caves and abandoned mine shafts dotted these mountains, many unexplored since the gold rush era. The cold drove most wildlife to lower elevations, but activity around these sites increased. I set up remote monitoring stations, using modified seismic sensors to detect movement patterns. The first real confrontation came during a blizzard. Wind howled through the trees, visibility down to mere feet. The motion sensors triggered at 2:17 a.m. all quadrants simultaneously. This wasn't random animal movement. Something was testing my perimeter, methodically probing for weaknesses. I positioned myself by the reinforced window, night vision equipment ready. The snow created a pale green landscape through the scope, shadows moving unnaturally against the wind. Temperature dropped suddenly. My digital thermometer showed a 30-degree plunge in minutes. The air grew thick, carrying that same chemical stench I'd encountered at the body sites. Movement caught my eye, a massive shape flowing between trees with impossible fluidity. No animal that size should move so smoothly. It passed through my first sensor ring, avoiding every tripwire with precise movements. The creature's form seemed to shift and ripple, adapting to spaces between trees that should have been too narrow for its bulk. I activated my recording equipment, determined to document everything. The footage later showed distortions, areas of complete darkness that seemed to absorb light. But what I witnessed with my own eyes was worse. The thing moved with purpose, its body a contradiction of angles and surfaces that hurt to look at directly. It approached my workshop first, investigating the tools I'd left outside as bait. Long, jointed appendages emerged from its mass, manipulating objects with disturbing precision. The motion reminded me of surgical procedures I'd witnessed during my service, calculated, deliberate movements that spoke of intelligence and planning. My breathing slowed, military training taking over. I watched it examine a broken chainsaw, those appendages working the pull cord, studying the mechanism. The behavior suggested learning, analysis. This wasn't mindless animal curiosity. The creature was building understanding. The encounter lasted 18 minutes. It retreated when my backup generator kicked in, the sunlight and noise triggering an immediate response. But it didn't flee in panic. The withdrawal was strategic, using available cover, maintaining awareness of exposed angles. Next morning revealed more questions than answers. Snow showed clear tracks leading to my perimeter, then nothing, as if the creature had materialized and vanished at will. The workshop tools bore strange residues, organic compounds that seemed to break down rapidly in daylight. My cameras captured only fragments of usable footage, plagued by electromagnetic interference that shouldn't have been possible with isolated power systems. Winter deepened, bringing more encounters. Each interaction revealed new aspects of its behavior. The thing was adapting, evolving its strategies. It disabled sensors before approaching, learned to avoid infrared detection, found blind spots in my security setup. I documented everything, filling notebooks with observations and sketches. Local authorities grew increasingly dismissive of my reports. They attributed missing persons cases to harsh weather conditions, explained away unusual findings with convenient natural causes. But I knew better. The pattern was escalating: more disappearances, more territorial markers, more sophisticated hunting techniques. The isolation began taking its toll. Sleep became rare, interrupted by sounds just at the edge of human hearing. I started seeing shapes in my peripheral vision, movement where nothing should move. The constant vigilance wore at my nerves, but I couldn't afford to lower my guard. The thing was watching, waiting, learning. I discovered its feeding ground in late January. A ravine, deep in the most inaccessible part of my territory. The site was methodically organized, remains sorted by type, arranged in patterns that suggested study rather than mere consumption. What disturbed me most were the signs of tool use, primitive but purposeful implements fashioned from bone and sinew. The creature's intelligence became increasingly apparent. It began leading its own markers, complex arrangements of broken equipment and organic matter that mimicked my survey points. It was communicating, or perhaps mocking my attempts to understand it. Each new discovery revealed layers of complexity that defied conventional explanation. Analysis of collected samples yielded disturbing results. The tissue fragments showed characteristics of multiple species, impossible combinations of cellular structures that shouldn't exist together. Under my microscope, the samples exhibited signs of active mutation, adapting to preserve themselves even hours after collection. The final confrontation approached inevitably. Weather patterns shifted, creating conditions reminiscent of that first encounter. The creature had established a predictable territory, its movements following mathematical progressions I began to recognize from my military data analysis training. It was building towards something in evolution or transformation I could sense but not fully comprehend. February brought the turning point. My motion sensors detected regular patterns of movement converging on the cabin. The creature had shifted from observation to active engagement. Its tracks now formed complex geometric patterns around my perimeter, precise circles and intersecting lines that couldn't be natural. My wildlife cameras captured increasingly disturbing images. The thing appeared larger, its form more defined yet somehow wrong. Analysis of nighttime footage showed it could now dislocate its joints, compress its mass to squeeze through spaces barely wider than my arm. The chemical smell grew stronger, becoming a constant presence that burned my throat and made my eyes water. The psychological pressure intensified. Sleep became impossible without medication, but I couldn't risk dulling my senses. I started hallucinating, or thought I was hallucinating, until the recordings confirmed what I saw. The creature could project images, create false sensory inputs. I witnessed impossible things: trees bending against gravity, shadows moving independent of light sources, the ground itself seeming to breathe. One night, it breached my inner perimeter. I awoke to the sound of my workshop door creaking open. Through my surveillance system, I watched it examining my tools with those impossibly articulated limbs. It picked up each implement, studied it, seemed to understand its purpose. Then it began improving them, modifying my equipment with grotesque efficiency, creating hybrid tools that merged organic and inorganic materials. The encounter that changed everything happened during a moonless night. Temperature dropped to record lows, my instruments registering impossible readings. The thing approached openly this time, no attempt at stealth. I watched through my rifle scope as it emerged from the tree line. Its true form defied sanity. The body was a mass of constantly shifting tissue, covered in a chitinous exoskeleton that reflected light like polished obsidian. Multiple limbs extended and retracted from its core, each ending in appendages that could transform from claws to something resembling hands. The head was worst, a complex arrangement of sensory organs surrounding what appeared to be a highly developed brain case. It stopped 30 yards from my position, oriented directly toward me. Those organs I took for eyes pulsed with bioluminescence. A sound filled my head, not audio, but direct neural interference. Images flooded my consciousness, vast spaces between stars, geometries that shouldn't exist, evolutionary paths that violated every natural law I knew. The creature was trying to communicate. I raised my rifle, years of training steadying my hands despite the horror before me. The thing made no aggressive moves. Instead, it began to change. Its form shifted, trying to approximate human shape. The attempt produced something worse than its natural state, an uncanny mimicry that revealed how alien its understanding of us really was. Time seemed to stop. We faced each other, human and other, each representing opposed forces of nature. I realized then that this wasn't about territory or hunting. The creature was conducting its own research, studying us as I had studied it. The bodies, the tool modifications, the communication attempts, all part of its learning process. The shot, when it came, was pure instinct. The creature's flesh parted around the impact, but no blood flowed. Instead, the wound sealed instantly, the bullet absorbed and analyzed like everything else. Its response was immediate and devastating. Every electronic device in my cabin overloaded simultaneously. The air itself seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made my bones resonate. I fired again and again, each shot absorbed and studied. The creature advanced methodically, adapting to each new weapon I deployed. In desperation, I reached for my last resort, an old flare gun, modified to fire magnesium charges. The flash was blinding, the heat intense enough to ignite nearby trees. The creature recoiled for the first time, its form destabilizing under the intense thermal assault. I seized the opportunity, launching every remaining flare into its mass. The reaction was catastrophic. The thing's body began to break down, complex chemical processes releasing clouds of toxic gas. I retreated into my cabin's safe room, sealed behind steel doors as the chemical fire consumed everything outside. By morning, nothing remained but scorched earth and crystalline formations that sublimated in sunlight. The forest was silent, no birds, no insects, no sign of life within half a mile of the site. My equipment was fried, cameras and sensors reduced to useless metal. The only evidence of what happened was a fine, iridescent powder that covered everything and quickly dissolved into nothing. I still live in these mountains, but not in the same way. My cabin is rebuilt, stronger now, with new defenses based on what I learned. The forest has begun to recover, wildlife slowly returning to reclaim their territory. But sometimes, during the coldest nights, I catch glimpses of movement in the trees, shapes that shouldn't exist, patterns that hurt to look at. The thing I killed wasn't unique. The patterns I documented, the evolutionary process I witnessed, it was all a test, an experiment conducted by something far more vast and incomprehensible. Out there in the darkness between the trees, more of them are watching, learning, adapting. They are still here, studying us, preparing. And someday, they'll be ready. The crunch of leaves under my boots echoed through the dense Arkansas wilderness as I made my way deeper into the Ouachita National Forest. 15 years with the United States Forest Service had taught me to trust my instincts, and something felt off about this patrol. My name is Eldon Markham, and I've spent most of my adult life in these woods. The morning had started routinely enough. I'd checked my gear, loaded up my patrol vehicle, and headed out to investigate reports of unusual animal activity in what locals called the Devil's Tract. The name always made me uncomfortable, not because I'm superstitious, but because names like that usually have roots in tragedy. My father, a Vietnam veteran who'd seen his share of horror, taught me everything I knew about survival. Trust your gut, he'd say, but verify with your eyes. Those words echoed in my mind as I noticed the unnatural silence surrounding me. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, just the whisper of wind through the trees. The radio at my hip crackled to life, breaking the eerie quiet. Dispatch to Markham, come in. The static-laden voice of Rita, our dispatcher, carried an edge of urgency. Markham here. Go ahead. We've got a missing persons report. Group of 3 hikers, last seen entering the Devil's Tract area yesterday afternoon. No contact since then. I pulled out my notebook, jotting down the details as Rita relayed them. Copy that. Any signs of their intended route? They were planning to camp near Boulder Creek. Local sheriff's deputy found their vehicle at the trailhead. I'm about 2 miles from there now. I'll head that way and start a sweep. Be careful, Markham. Something doesn't feel right about this one. I couldn't agree more. The Devil's Track had seen its share of disappearances over the years, more than could be explained by normal wilderness hazards. Most were written off as accidents or exposure, but those of us who worked these woods knew better. There were patterns that didn't add up, details that didn't make sense. The air grew colder as I approached Boulder Creek, despite the summer heat. My breath came out in visible puffs, like it would on a winter morning. The dense canopy overhead cast strange shadows on the forest floor, creating patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed from the corner of my eye. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a shredded backpack caught in a thorn bush. The material hadn't been torn by any animal I recognized. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate. I bagged it for evidence and continued my search, following a trail of disturbed vegetation and occasional blood spots. The campsite appeared suddenly, nestled in a small clearing. What I found there made my blood run cold. 3 tents lay in tatters, their contents scattered across the ground. Sleeping bags had been slashed open, their stuffing spread like snow. A camping stove lay crushed, not dented or dropped, but compressed as if squeezed by an enormous hand. But it was the tracks that truly unsettled me. In 15 years of service, I'd learned to read sign like most people read books. These prints didn't match anything in my experience. They suggested something bipedal but massive, with a stride length that defied natural law. I radioed in my position and findings, careful to stick to the facts. Dispatch, I found signs of violence at the campsite. Send backup and alert local authorities. The radio crackled with static before Rita's voice came through, barely audible. Copy, backup, hours. The transmission cut out entirely. A twig snapped in the dense undergrowth behind me. I spun around, hand on my sidearm, scanning the trees. The shadows seemed to deepen despite the midday sun. Movement caught my eye, something large ducking behind a massive oak tree. I drew my weapon, years of training taking over. Forest Service. Come out where I can see you. A figure stumbled into view, clothes torn and bloody. It was a man in his 30s, face scratched and eyes wild with fear. He raised his hands, trembling. Please, help me, he gasped before collapsing. I rushed to his side, checking his vitals while maintaining awareness of my surroundings. His pulse was rapid but strong. After giving him water and basic first aid, he regained enough composure to speak. I'm Daniel Hargrove, he managed between shaky breaths. We were attacked last night. Something came into our camp. What kind of something? I asked, keeping my voice steady and professional. His eyes darted around the clearing. I don't know. It was dark. Big. Moved like nothing I've ever seen. Took them both. I ran. Been running ever since. I helped Daniel to his feet. We need to move. This position isn't secure. The sun was beginning to set, and I knew we needed to find shelter before dark. There's an old ranger station about 2 miles from here. Can you walk? He nodded, though his legs were still unsteady. As we moved through the forest, I noticed more signs that something was wrong. The wildlife remained eerily silent. Branches had been broken at heights no normal animal could reach. And the tracks, those impossible tracks, continued to appear sporadically. Night fell faster than expected as we made our way through the dense forest. The old ranger station appeared ahead, a dark silhouette against the darkening sky. It wasn't much, but it would provide better shelter than the open woods. I led Daniel inside, sweeping each room with my flashlight before securing the perimeter. We'll stay here until dawn, I said, checking the windows and doors. Help me barricade these entrances. We worked quickly, pushing old furniture against the doors and covering the windows with whatever we could find. The station had been abandoned for years, but some emergency supplies remained: stale water, first aid supplies, and a few emergency flares. I found an old radio unit and tried to call for help, but only static answered. Daniel sat heavily in a corner, his breathing still unsteady. "What was that thing back there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been camping all my life. I know what bears look like, what mountain lions sound like. This was different." I checked my ammunition while considering his question. "I've worked these woods for 15 years, I replied carefully. "Seen all kinds of things, but nothing like those tracks back there." I paused, listening to the sounds outside. "Tell me exactly what happened at your campsite." Daniel's story came out in fragments, interrupted by long pauses as he struggled to make sense of his memories. They had set up camp late afternoon, nothing unusual about the site or their surroundings. After dark, they heard something moving outside their tents. At first, they thought it was a bear. "But bears don't walk upright for that long," he said, his voice shaking. "And they don't try to talk to you." That made me look up sharply. "Talk?" It mimicked my friend's voice. "Called out for help." "When you went to look." Daniel's voice broke. It took him so fast. We barely had time to scream. A sound outside interrupted his story, branches breaking, but too high up to be from any normal animal. We both froze, listening intently. Heavy footsteps circled the station, accompanied by a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl. The creature's footsteps grew closer to the ranger station. I positioned myself near a window, gun ready, while keeping Daniel behind me. Through the broken blinds, I caught glimpses of movement in the moonlight. The thing was massive, its shape somehow wrong in ways that defied explanation. "Keep absolutely still," I whispered to Daniel. Years of training kicked in as I controlled my breathing, steadying my hands. The creature circled the building once more, then suddenly went silent. The quiet was worse than the noise. A scraping sound came from the roof. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling as something heavy moved above us. I motioned for Daniel to move toward the back room, away from the main area. We needed options if things went wrong. The radio suddenly crackled to life, making us both jump. Through the static, I could barely make out Rita's voice. "Markham, respond, search team." The transmission cut off as abruptly as it had started. That's when the creature crashed through the ceiling. I fired 3 rounds in quick succession, the muzzle flash illuminating a nightmare. The thing was easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its joints bent at impossible angles. And its face, I forced myself not to look directly at its face. The bullets seemed to have little effect. The creature lunged forward with impossible speed. I dove to the side, pushing Daniel toward the back door. "Run!" I shouted, firing again to keep the thing's attention on me. We burst out of the station into the cold night air. The forest was a maze of shadows, but I knew these woods. I led us toward a steep ravine I'd mapped years ago. No animal would follow us down there. The creature's roar shook the trees behind us. It was gaining ground faster than anything its size should move. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell its rancid odor getting closer. The ravine loomed ahead of us, a black gash in the earth. Without hesitation, I led Daniel down the steep incline, using roots and rocks as handholds. The creature's roars echoed above us, but I knew this terrain. Years of mapping and patrolling these woods had taught me every dangerous curve and hidden path. "There's a cave system ahead," I whispered to Daniel. "We can use it to throw off our scent." The cave entrance was barely visible in the darkness, hidden behind a curtain of vines. I pulled out my backup flashlight and led us inside. The air was damp and cold, smelling of wet stone and decay. Our footsteps echoed off the narrow walls as we ventured deeper. "How do you know about this place?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Part of my job is knowing every inch of these woods," I replied, keeping my voice low. "Including the places most people never see." We moved carefully through the cave system, the beam of my flashlight revealing ancient formations and narrow passages. The sound of dripping water echoed around us, making it impossible to tell if we were being followed. After what felt like hours of navigating the underground maze, we emerged on the other side of the ridge. The pre-dawn light was just beginning to soften the eastern sky. We had covered nearly 2 miles underground, and the creature's sounds had faded completely. But our relief was short-lived. As we caught our breath, I noticed something disturbing about the cave entrance we'd just emerged from. There were claw marks on the rocks, old ones, deeply scored into the stone. And beneath them, scattered among the leaves and dirt, were bones. Not animal bones. "We need to keep moving," I said, pulling Daniel away from the grim discovery. "The nearest ranger station is about 3 miles east. We can make it by sunrise if we hurry." We emerged from the cave system as dawn began to break. The forest was different here, older, with massive trees that blocked most of the morning light. Our clothes were soaked with cave water and sweat, and every muscle ached from the ordeal. "The logging road should be about half a mile east," I said, checking my compass. The device was spinning wildly, unable to find true north. I frowned, tapping it against my palm, but the needle continued its erratic dance. "Something wrong?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Magnetic interference. Happens sometimes near mineral deposits. But I'd never seen it this severe. We'd have to navigate by the sun and my knowledge of the terrain." The forest floor was different here. The usual carpet of leaves and pine needles was replaced by bare earth, hard-packed and oddly smooth. There were no signs of small animal life, no droppings, no burrows, not even insects. The silence was absolute. "Look at this," Daniel called softly. He was standing near a massive oak tree, pointing at its trunk. Deep gouges marked the bark, but these weren't like the claw marks we'd seen before. These were deliberate patterns, almost like writing, but in no alphabet I recognized. Similar marks appeared on other trees as we continued east. They seemed to be increasing in frequency, and I noticed they all pointed in the same direction, deeper into the forest, away from our planned route. A distant sound stopped us both in our tracks. It wasn't the creature's roar, but something almost worse, a human voice, calling for help. It sounded like a child. "That's impossible," Daniel whispered. "We're miles from any trail." The voice called again, closer this time. It was moving toward us with unnatural speed. I grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him behind a fallen log. "Whatever you hear," I whispered, "whatever you see, we keep moving east. Understand?" He nodded, his face pale with understanding. The voice called again, this time from directly above us. We looked up slowly. Looking up, we saw nothing but branches swaying in a wind that didn't reach the forest floor. The voice called again, now behind us, then to our left, then our right, moving faster than anything human could move. "Run," I whispered, and we broke into a sprint toward where I believed the logging road would be. The voice followed, changing as it pursued us. It shifted from a child's cry to an adult scream, then to something that wasn't quite human at all. The trees began to thin out, and I caught glimpses of what looked like structures through the branches, old foundations, crumbling stone walls reclaimed by nature. This area wasn't on any of my maps, but the ruins suggested there had once been a settlement here. We came upon a clearing containing the remains of what might have been a church. Its stone walls still stood about chest high, with a single arch marking where the entrance had been. Ancient graves dotted the area around it, their headstones worn smooth by time. "We shouldn't be here," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "This feels wrong." He was right. The air had grown noticeably colder, and that oppressive silence had intensified. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the ground itself was absorbing the sound. A movement caught my eye, something ducking behind one of the walls. It was too tall to be human, its movements too fluid to be natural. I raised my gun, knowing I had only 2 rounds left. "There's another one," Daniel whispered, pointing toward the tree line. More shapes were emerging from the forest, moving with that same unnatural grace. They were surrounding us. I backed us toward the church ruins. At least there we'd have some cover, something solid at our backs. As we moved, I noticed more of those strange markings carved into the stones, the same patterns we'd seen on the trees. The creatures were fully visible now, moving in perfect synchronization as they closed the circle around us. In the growing light, I could see details I wished I hadn't, the way their forms seemed to ripple and shift, the impossible angles of their limbs, the faces that weren't quite faces. The creatures moved closer, their forms shifting in ways that hurt to look at. I backed us further into the church ruins, my mind racing through options. The sun was rising higher, casting long shadows through the broken walls. That's when I noticed something crucial. The creatures were avoiding the direct sunlight. They stayed in the shadows, moving only through the darkened areas. The graves, I whispered to Daniel. Look at the shadows. The ancient headstones cast long shadows across the ground, creating a network of darkness that the creatures were using to approach us. But between us and the logging road was a stretch of open ground, fully lit by the morning sun. I checked my watch, 6:47 a.m. The sun would only get higher, eliminating more shadows. If we could hold out, we might have a chance. When I say run, I breathed, head straight east. Don't stop, don't look back. A loud crack echoed through the clearing as one of the creatures tested the edge of a shadow, reaching toward us with an impossibly long limb. The sunlight seemed to make its flesh ripple and distort. My radio suddenly crackled to life, making us all freeze. Through the static, I could hear Rita's voice. Markham, rescue team, coordinates. The creatures reacted to the sound, pulling back slightly. I used their momentary distraction to make our move. Run. We bolted across the open ground, our boots pounding against the hard earth. Behind us, I heard sounds of pursuit, but they were limited to the shadowed areas. We ran straight toward the rising sun, its light now bright enough to be almost blinding. It started as a typical road trip with my buddies, just a weekend getaway to unwind. We were headed to a cabin deep in the Adirondacks, far away from the city noise. My name is Zane Underwood, and I've always been the guy who planned our little adventures. This time, however, it seemed like the universe had other plans for us. We left early in the morning, the car packed with snacks, drinks, and enough enthusiasm to fuel a rocket. There were 4 of us, myself, Wes, Marco, and Tori. We'd been friends since college, bonded over our mutual love of the outdoors and the thrill of exploring the unknown. Our destination was supposed to be a secluded cabin I'd rented online, promising tranquility and the perfect spot for stargazing. The trip was supposed to take about 4 hours, but somewhere along the way, Marco insisted we take a detour. He had heard of a scenic route that supposedly offered breathtaking views of the mountains. It seemed like a good idea at the time, so we veered off the main highway onto a narrow, winding road. The scenery was indeed stunning, with dense forests stretching out on either side and the peaks of the Adirondacks looming in the distance. We were making good time until we hit a fork in the road that wasn't on the map. Wes, who was driving, glanced at me for direction, but I was just as puzzled. Let's take the left, Marco suggested from the back seat. It feels right. Feels right? Tori mocked. Since when do you have a GPS in your gut? We all laughed, and Wes shrugged, turning left. The road seemed less maintained, with patches of dirt and gravel. We drove on, the car jostling with each bump, but the forest around us was captivating. After about 30 minutes, though, the road narrowed even further, and the trees seemed to close in on us. Are we lost? Tori asked, her tone shifting from playful to concerned. No, we're not lost, I said, though doubt was creeping in. The GPS had lost signal, and our phones were barely getting a bar. We pressed on, hoping to find a landmark or a sign. That's when we saw a dilapidated signpost, half hidden by overgrown shrubs. It pointed toward a place called Hollisville, with the words barely legible. None of us had heard of it, but it seemed like our only option. Wes turned onto the gravel road it indicated. The path was rough, the trees thickening into a dense canopy overhead, blotting out most of the sunlight. The deeper we went, the more uneasy we all became. Conversation died down, replaced by the sound of tires crunching over gravel and the occasional rustle from the forest. After what felt like an eternity, we saw the first sign of civilization, a rusted-out pickup truck abandoned on the side of the road. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades. Wes slowed down, and we all peered at it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Should we turn back? Wes asked, his voice tinged with unease. We've come this far, Marco said, though his bravado seemed forced. "Let's just find this town and ask for directions." We pressed on, and soon the road opened up to what could only be described as a ghost town. Hollisville was a cluster of old, decaying buildings, some barely standing, others completely collapsed. The air was thick with the smell of rot and mildew. It was like stepping into a forgotten past. "This place gives me the creeps," Tori muttered. "Yeah, no kidding," I replied. "Let's just find someone and get the hell out of here." We parked the car and got out, the gravel crunching under our feet. The town was eerily silent, the only sound the faint whisper of wind through the trees. We walked toward what looked like the main street, our eyes scanning for any sign of life. And then we saw them. A group of figures emerged from one of the buildings. At first, I thought they were just locals, but as they got closer, it became clear something was very wrong. They were dressed in ragged clothes, their faces dirty and gaunt. There was a wildness in their eyes that sent a chill down my spine. One of them called out, his voice raspy and guttural. "We're lost," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We were hoping to get some directions. The man grinned, revealing teeth that were yellowed and broken. "Well, you've come to the right place." Before we could react, more figures appeared from the shadows, surrounding us. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were trapped. "Let's get out of here," Wes whispered, and we started to back away, but they closed in quickly. Now, the man said, his grin widening. "No need to rush. We've got plenty of time to get to know each other." We turned and bolted for the car, but they were on us in an instant. One of them grabbed Tori, dragging her to the ground. Wes and Marco tried to fight them off, but there were too many. I reached for Tori, but someone tackled me from behind, sending me sprawling. Chaos erupted. Wes managed to break free and sprinted towards the car, but one of the men threw a rock, hitting him in the back of the head. Wes fell, motionless. Marco was faring no better, pinned down by two of the men, struggling desperately. They dragged us back into the town, our resistance futile. Tori was screaming, tears streaming down her face. They forced us into one of the decrepit buildings, the interior as rotten and decayed as the rest of the town. We were thrown into a dark, dank room, the door slamming shut behind us. The reality of our situation was sinking in. We were prisoners in a place that time had forgotten, at the mercy of people who seemed more like feral animals than humans. The air was thick with a stench of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp. Wes groaned, blood trickling down the side of his face. "They're gonna kill us, aren't they?" Tori's voice was a whisper filled with terror. "No," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "We'll find a way." Hours passed, each one dragging on longer than the last. Occasionally we heard footsteps outside, the sound of low voices, but no one came in. We were left to rot in the darkness, fear gnawing our sanity. At some point, Marco stood up, his expression hardening. "I'm not waiting around to die. We need to find a way out." He started to examine the room, looking for any possible escape. The walls were crumbling, the wood rotting, but there were no windows, and the door was solid. I joined him, desperate for any hope. "Look here," Marco whispered, pointing to a section of the wall where the wood was particularly decayed. "If we can break through this, we might be able to get out." We worked silently, prying at the wood with our fingers, using anything we could find to dig into the rotten wall. The progress was slow, but it was something. Hours felt like days as we chipped away, our fingers bleeding and raw. Finally, we managed to create a hole big enough to squeeze through. Marco went first, peering through the gap to make sure the coast was clear. He nodded, and we followed, one by one, emerging into the cold night air. The town was still eerily quiet, but we didn't waste any time. We stuck to the shadows, moving as silently as we could, hearts pounding in our chests. Our goal was simple: get to the car and get the hell out of there. We made it to the edge of the town without incident, but just as we were about to reach the car, a shout rang out. They had spotted us. Panic surged through me, and we sprinted the last few yards, throwing ourselves into the car. "Go, go, go!" I shouted at Wes, who fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and we tore out of there, the figures chasing after us, their shouts growing fainter as we sped down the gravel road. None of us spoke as we drove, the horror of what we had just escaped sinking in. We drove for hours until we finally reached a small town with a police station. We stumbled in, disheveled and traumatized, barely coherent as we tried to explain what had happened. The officers were skeptical at first, but when we led them back to Hollisville, the truth was undeniable. The buildings were there, just as we described, but they were empty. The people who had captured us were gone, vanished into the woods. But there was evidence, blood stains, discarded clothes, and bones scattered around, grim proof of the nightmare we had lived through. It took weeks for the reality of it all to sink in, and we were never the same. We had escaped with our lives, but Hollisville had left its mark on us. We never spoke of it again, each of us dealing with the memories in our own way. As we stood there, watching the officers comb through the ruins of the town, I felt a strange mix of relief and horror. We had survived, but the shadows of that place would haunt us forever. And that was that. The investigation that followed our escape revealed disturbing details about Hollisville's history. The town had been officially abandoned in the 1950s after the local mining industry collapsed, but rumors persisted about strange occurrences in the area. Local hunters reported avoiding the region, claiming it felt wrong. There were stories of missing hikers and campers dating back decades. The police investigation uncovered a network of tunnels beneath the town, presumably from the old mining operations. What they found there made even hardened officers pale. The tunnels had been lived in recently. They found makeshift living quarters, storage areas filled with stolen goods, and worse, evidence of other victims who hadn't been as fortunate as us. Forensics teams spent weeks documenting everything. They found personal effects belonging to missing persons from several surrounding states. The oldest dated back to the 1970s. The people who had captured us weren't just deranged squatters, they were part of something much darker, a legacy of violence that had been hidden in these woods for generations. The physical wounds healed quickly enough. The cut on Wes's head needed 12 stitches, but left only a small scar. My ribs were bruised from the tackle, and Marco's shoulder was sprained from the struggle. Tora had a nasty gash on her leg that required some minor surgery. But the psychological scars ran deeper. Nightmares became a regular occurrence. In mine, I was always back in that dark room, the sound of footsteps approaching, knowing what waited on the other side of the door. Wes couldn't sleep without lights on anymore. Marco threw himself into work, taking extra shifts at the hospital where he worked as a nurse, anything to keep his mind occupied. Tori moved away, saying she needed a fresh start somewhere far from woods and mountains. The media caught wind of the story eventually. They called it the Hollisville Horror, running sensational pieces about cannibalistic mountain folk and lost towns. None of them got it right. They couldn't capture the reality of what we experienced, the absolute terror of being trapped in that room, the crushing certainty that we were going to die there. I found myself obsessing over the town's history, spending hours researching in libraries and online archives. I learned that Hollisville had once been a prosperous mining community, home to over 500 people. The mine produced silver and zinc, enough to keep the town wealthy through the early 1900s. But there were always dark rumors. Local newspapers from the period reported occasional disappearances, usually dismissed as mining accidents or people moving away without notice. But reading between the lines, a pattern emerged. Every few years, people would vanish, usually outsiders, travelers passing through. The town's isolation made investigation difficult, and most cases were eventually forgotten. When the mine closed in 1947, most of the population left within months. Those who remained were mostly the old families, people whose roots in the valley went back generations. By 1952, the town was officially abandoned. But maybe not everyone left. Maybe something remained, something that had been there all along, hiding in the shadows of this seemingly normal mining town. The police never found our captors. They organized sweeps of the surrounding forest, brought in tracking dogs, even used thermal imaging from helicopters. But the woods around Hollisville were vast and dense, filled with caves and old mine shafts, perfect hiding places for those who knew the terrain. 6 months after our escape, I received a letter. No return address, just my name written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words, "We're still here." I turned it over to the police, who added it to their file, but we all knew the truth. They were out there, watching, waiting. Maybe they found another abandoned town, another dark corner of the world to call their own. The experience changed how I saw the world. I became acutely aware of the thin veneer of civilization that covers our society, how quickly it can be stripped away. The people in Hollisville weren't monsters from some horror movie. They were humans who had chosen to embrace something darker, something primitive that lurks in all of us. A year after our escape, I returned to Hollisville one last time. The police had finished their investigation, and the town was scheduled for demolition. The county had decided it was safer to raise what remained than risk anyone else stumbling upon it. I stood at the edge of town, watching as the sun set behind the mountains. The buildings looked smaller somehow, less menacing in the fading light. But the feeling of wrongness remained, a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe. As darkness fell, I heard something, a distant sound that might have been the wind through the trees, or might have been laughter echoing from the shadows. I didn't stay to find out. Some questions are better left unanswered, some places better left forgotten. The demolition crew came the next week, reducing the remaining buildings to rubble. They filled in the mine entrances with concrete and posted warning signs throughout the area. But you can't erase history so easily. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I think about Hollisville. I think about the people who lived there, both before and after its abandonment. I think about the secrets still buried in those woods, the stories that will never be told. And I wonder if somewhere, in another forgotten corner of the world, something similar is happening right now. The 4 of us still keep in touch, bound together by our shared trauma. We meet once a year for dinner, but we never talk about what happened. We don't mean to. It's there in the way we all check the exits when we enter a room, and how we tense up at unexpected sounds, in the haunted look that sometimes crosses our faces when we think no one's watching. Last month, I read about a family that went missing in the Adirondacks. Their car was found on a remote forest road, their campsite undisturbed. The article mentioned that they had veered off their planned route, taking an unmarked road in search of a scenic viewpoint. I called the investigating officer and told him our story. He listened patiently, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. "Just another missing persons case," he assured me. "They probably got lost in the woods." Maybe he was right. Maybe I'm seeing connections that aren't there, finding patterns in random events. But I know what's out there. I've seen the darkness that hides in forgotten places, in the spaces between civilized worlds. And I know that somewhere, right now, someone else is taking a wrong turn, following a road that isn't on any map, about to discover that some towns are better left lost. The world feels different now, smaller somehow, yet filled with more shadows than before. I've started locking my doors at night, something I never used to do. I've installed security cameras around my house and keep a loaded gun in my bedside drawer. Paranoid? Perhaps. But I've learned that the real horrors in this world aren't the monsters from movies or books. They're the ones that wear human faces, that live in the dark spaces we pretend don't exist. I still go camping occasionally, still enjoy the outdoors. But I stick to marked trails now, well-traveled paths where other hikers are always within earshot. I don't take shortcuts or explore unmarked roads. Some might say the experience broke something in me, made me fearful. I prefer to think it made me wiser. There are places in this world that don't want to be found, secrets that should remain buried. The official report on Hollisville remains inconclusive. The FBI got involved eventually, adding the case to their database of unsolved crimes. They interviewed us multiple times, trying to piece together what had happened. But without bodies, without suspects, there wasn't much they could do. The case is still open, gathering dust in some filing cabinet. Sometimes I dream about that hole we dug in the wall, about crawling through it into the night. In my dreams, I'm always alone, and what waits on the other side isn't freedom but something worse, a darkness so complete it has substance, a void that reaches out with hungry hands. I wake from these dreams drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the taste of rot and decay in my mouth. But we survived. That's what I tell myself on the bad days, when the memories threaten to overwhelm me. We got out. We're still here. The town is gone now, buried under rubble and concrete, its secrets sealed away. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if we really escaped at all, or if part of us is still there, trapped in that dark room, waiting for footsteps that never stop coming. My name is Christopher Stormrider, and I'm 42 years old. What I'm about to tell you is a story about a time when things went very wrong for me and a few others in a small, almost forgotten town in Wyoming called Encampment. It was 2008, and I was working as a mechanic, which suited me just fine. I've always been good with my hands, fixing things, getting dirty. There wasn't much I couldn't fix, or so I thought. Encampment isn't the kind of place you'd find on a map unless you were really looking for it. Nestled in the shadows of the Sierra Madre mountain range, it's a quiet town with a population of just under 500 people. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, for better or worse. For me, it was mostly for the better. I lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, didn't have many friends, but I got along well with my neighbor, Tom, who ran the local diner. Tom's place, the Rusty Spoon, was a fixture in Encampment. It was where folks gathered to swap stories over coffee in the morning and where the day's gossip was dissected over pie in the evening. Tom and I would often spend our evenings there after closing, talking about nothing in particular over a couple of beers. It was during one of these late-night chats that Tom first mentioned the disappearances. Now, Wyoming has its share of missing hikers and hunters each year. The wilderness is vast and unforgiving, and it's easy for even experienced outdoorsmen to get lost. But this was different. These weren't out-of-towners who had wandered off the trail. These were locals, people who had lived in Encampment their whole lives, who knew the land like the back of their hand. They were vanishing without a trace. "It's like something's out there, Chris," Tom said one night, his eyes darting to the window that looked out onto the darkened street. "Something's hunting people." I laughed it off at first. "You've been watching too many of those ghost hunting shows, Tom," I said, taking a swig of my beer. But even as the words left my mouth, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something in Tom's voice, a note of genuine fear, that made me uneasy. Life carried on as usual for a while after that conversation. I spent my days at the garage, fixing up cars and chatting with the locals who came in. But Tom's words lingered in the back of my mind, and I found myself paying more attention to the whispered conversations around town. Then came the night that changed everything. I was at Tom's diner, as usual. It was late, and the place was empty except for us. We were watching some old western on the TV when suddenly the lights flickered. Tom and I exchanged a glance, but we shrugged it off and continued watching. The flickering stopped, and we forgot about it until Tom went to close up and found the back door wide open. "I swear I locked it," he said, his face pale in the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen. "Maybe it was the wind," I suggested, but we both knew better. That door had a heavy latch. No wind was going to open it. Tom decided to stay over at my place that night. We didn't talk about it, but I knew he was spooked. I didn't mind the company. There was something comforting about having another person in the house, especially with the unsettling events of the evening. The next day, news came that another person had gone missing. This time, it was Edna, an elderly lady who lived alone on the outskirts of town. Her place was found empty, door wide open, a pot of stew still simmering on the stove. No signs of struggle, no footprints, nothing. It was like she had just walked out and disappeared into thin air. The town was buzzing with the news. I could see the fear in people's eyes as they came into the garage, hear it in their hushed conversations. Some said it was a wild animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion that had developed a taste for human flesh. Others talked about ghosts, spirits angry at the encroachment of the town on their ancient lands. A few even suggested there was a killer among us, picking off the vulnerable one by one. I started paying more attention to the stories Tom was telling me. We were both on edge, jumping at shadows and unexpected noises. The carefree evenings at the diner were replaced by tense discussions about the latest rumors and theories. One night, I couldn't sleep. The silence of the town, usually so peaceful, now felt oppressive. It was around midnight when I decided to take a walk, hoping the cold night air would clear my head. As I passed by Edna's house, I saw something move in the shadows. I froze, squinting to see better, but there was nothing. I shook it off as my imagination and turned around to go back home, but the feeling of being watched lingered. A few days later, I had a late-night visitor. Tom banged on my door, pale and shaking. "I saw something," he gasped as I let him in. "In the woods behind the diner." It wasn't natural, Chris." I grabbed my shotgun. It wasn't loaded, but it made us feel better, and we headed out. The woods were pitch black, the beam of our flashlights seeming pitifully inadequate against the darkness. We didn't see anything that night, but we both felt like we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent our hearts racing. The disappearances continued, and the town was in a panic. People were locking their doors, kids weren't allowed to play outside, and anyone who could leave did. Those of us who stayed were left with a sense of dread that hung over the town like a heavy fog. One evening, I was working late at the garage when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like a faint cry for help. I grabbed my flashlight and went to investigate. The sound was coming from the woods. Against my better judgment, I ventured in. I kept walking, calling out, but the cry stopped. Suddenly, there was silence, so complete it was almost deafening. I turned to head back when I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. It moved fast, too fast for me to react. I stumbled back, falling over a log. By the time I got up, it was gone. I ran back to the garage, locked the doors, and called Tom. He came over, and we spent the night trying to make sense of what I saw. We both agreed it was something not natural, but what it was, we couldn't say. The next day, Sheriff Arnold came by. He was a tough guy, not easily rattled, but even he looked worried. He asked us to keep quiet about what we saw, said it would only cause more panic. He told us he was forming a search party to look for the missing people and asked if we'd join. We agreed. It wasn't like we had much of a choice. The search party consisted of me, Tom, Sheriff Arnold, and a few other townsfolk. We combed the woods for days, finding nothing but more questions. One of the guys, Bill, swore he saw something similar to what I described, but no one else did. Then, one night, it happened. We were camping out in the woods, taking turns keeping watch. It was my shift when I heard rustling in the bushes. I pointed my flashlight and saw it again, those glowing eyes. Before I could react, it charged at us. The camp erupted into chaos. People were shouting, firing their guns blindly into the dark. I managed to get a clear shot, but it didn't seem to do any good. The thing was fast, too fast. By the time the chaos died down, Bill was gone. We searched for him until dawn, but found no trace. Sheriff Arnold decided it was too dangerous to continue and called off the search. We headed back to town, defeated and terrified. Back in encampment, things got worse. More people went missing, and those who remained were too scared to leave their homes. The town felt like a ghost town, with shuttered windows and empty streets. The fear was palpable, hanging in the air like a thick, choking fog. Tom and I decided to take matters into our own hands. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find: my shotgun, Tom's old hunting rifle, and a collection of homemade weapons that looked more likely to hurt us than any creature. We set out to hunt the thing, determined to end the terror that had gripped our town. We spent days tracking it, following the faintest of trails. Strange markings on trees, tufts of coarse hair caught on branches, and the occasional glimpse of those haunting, glowing eyes in the distance. Finally, we found its lair, a cave deep in the woods. We could smell it before we saw it, a foul stench of decay that made our eyes water. We entered cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The cave was littered with bones, some animal, some unmistakably human. Then we saw it. The thing was hunched over, gnawing on something I didn't want to identify. It looked up, eyes glowing, and let out a noise that sent chills down my spine. It was like a cross between a growl and a scream, something no human throat could produce. It charged at us. Tom fired first, hitting it in the shoulder. I followed, aiming for its head. It staggered but didn't go down. It was on us in seconds, knocking Tom to the ground. I fired again and again, emptying my gun into it until it finally collapsed. We stood there, panting, staring at the lifeless body. It looked human, but twisted, deformed. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over an emaciated frame. The hands ended in long, sharp claws, and its mouth was filled with rows of needle-like teeth. We dragged it out of the cave and burned it, not knowing what else to do. The disappearances stopped after that. Life in encampments slowly returned to normal, but the town was never quite the same. People who left never came back, and those who stayed never spoke about what happened. Tom and I kept our secret, telling ourselves it was for the best. We never talked about that night, but every now and then, I catch him looking at the woods with a haunted look in his eyes. We survived, but we weren't the same. I still work at the garage, fixing cars, living my life. But every time I hear a noise in the woods, I wonder if there's something else out there, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I can still see those glowing eyes and wonder if we really killed it or just made it angry. This is my story. It's not a happy one, but it's the truth. I guess some things are better left buried in the past, forgotten like the town of encampment. But the memories linger, and the fear never really goes away. The summer of 2020 was a time I'll never forget. As the world grappled with the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic, our once bustling community transformed into a ghost town overnight. Streets that used to buzz with life now lay eerily silent, parks stood abandoned, and the very fabric of human interaction seemed to unravel before our eyes. Though our town wasn't hit as hard by the virus as some others, the atmosphere of fear and isolation was palpable. I remember the shock of seeing businesses shuttered, their windows dark and uninviting. Jobs evaporated like morning dew, and we were all instructed to remain indoors. Those first 3 months felt like an eternity. Trapped within the confines of my home, I found myself battling an intense case of cabin fever. The walls seemed to close in with each passing day, threatening to crush my sanity. In those early days of lockdown, walking became my sole refuge. It was the one activity that wasn't explicitly forbidden, a lifeline to the outside world that I clung to desperately. So, I walked. I traversed the empty suburbs, their manicured lawns now unkempt and wild. I wandered through deserted parks, the swing sets creaking mournfully in the breeze. I ventured into the woods just outside of town, hoping that the ancient trees might offer some wisdom, some comfort in these uncertain times. The few stores that remained open became landmarks on my daily expeditions. Even if I didn't need to buy anything, I'd find myself drawn to these islands of normality in a sea of chaos. Sometimes, I'd just stand outside, watching the masked figures inside move about their business, a reminder that life, somehow, was continuing. As the days stretched into weeks, my walks evolved into something more. The notion of hiking took root in my mind, a way to push myself further, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the town. I needed to be outside, to breathe the free air, to remind myself that the world was larger than the four walls of my home. 1 week melted into the next, and soon I found myself mapping out routes in my mind. Each new path became a lifeline, a thread connecting me to the world beyond the pandemic. The trails became my sanctuary, a place where the worries of the world seemed to fade away with each step. By the time a month had passed, I had become intimately familiar with every hiking trail within a 10-mile radius of my home. I found a particular joy in the rhythm of my footsteps against the forest floor, the crunch of leaves and twigs a percussive counterpoint to the whispers of the wind through the trees. These sounds became a balm for my soul, drowning out the constant hum of anxiety that had become the backdrop of our lives. As summer wore on, I felt an edge creeping into my psyche, a restlessness that even my daily hikes couldn't fully assuage. I craved something more, a challenge, a test, a trail long enough to feel like a real journey. Most of my walking had been done around town, but as I branched out into the forests and hillsides, I knew I wanted to swap the familiar for the wilderness. That's when I made the decision to tackle my longest hike yet, a 10-mile loop that would take me deep into the heart of the nearby national forest. I spent days planning, poring over maps, and gathering supplies. The night before my trek, I barely slept, my mind racing with anticipation and a touch of nervousness. I woke before dawn, the world outside still shrouded in darkness. As I drove to the trailhead, I watched the sun slowly paint the sky in hues of pink and gold, a sight that filled me with a sense of hope and possibility. When I arrived at the parking lot, however, my excitement was tempered by an unexpected sight, or rather, the lack of one. The lot was completely empty, not another car in sight. I sat in my vehicle for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird. I had expected the trail to be busy, given how many people had taken up outdoor activities during the lockdown. The emptiness of the lot sent a shiver down my spine, a reminder that I would truly be alone out there. Pushing aside my unease, I began to pack my gear meticulously. Water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit, and a detailed map of the area all went into my backpack. I double-checked everything, acutely aware that a forgotten item could spell disaster on a solo trek like this. As I shouldered my pack and locked my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around, half expecting to see another hiker emerging from the tree line, but there was nothing. Just the wind rustling through the leaves and the crunch of gravel under my boots. I set off with a brisk pace, the familiar rhythm of hiking soon calming my nerves. The trail started off easy, winding through sun-dappled forests and across babbling streams. The solitude, which had initially felt oppressive, gradually became a comfort. Out here, away from the constant reminders of the pandemic, I could almost pretend that the world hadn't changed. 3 miles in, I paused to catch my breath and take in the view. The forest stretched out before me, a sea of green undulating to the horizon. I felt a sense of peace wash over me, the worries of the past few months receding like the tide. As the morning transitioned to noon, I found myself loving every second of the hike. The physical exertion, the fresh air, the beauty of nature, it all combined to create a sense of euphoria I hadn't experienced in months. I allowed myself to wander a bit, lulled into a false sense of security by the seeming benevolence of the forest. It was then that I spotted it, a stone peak jutting out over the tree line in the distance. Something about it called to me, a siren song of adventure and discovery. I knew it wasn't on my planned route, but the longer I looked at it, the more I wanted to get up close and see it for myself. I estimated it would be about a 2-mile detour, a straight shot through what looked like open, rolling badlands with occasional tree thickets. A voice in the back of my mind whispered caution, reminding me of the dangers of going off-trail. But after months of following rules and restrictions, the allure of spontaneity was too strong to resist. With a deep breath and a final glance at my map, I stepped off the marked trail and into the unknown. The terrain quickly became more challenging, the even path giving way to uneven ground dotted with rocks and scrub brush. But the peak loomed ever closer, spurring me on. It was in this desolate part of the forest that I first noticed something odd. Near the base of a small ravine lay a pair of worn-out hiking boots, their laces tangled like a junk drawer. Next to them, a couple of folded shirts fluttered in the breeze, pinned down by a small rock. I paused, my curiosity piqued. It wasn't unusual to find the occasional piece of litter on a trail, but this seemed different. The clothes were deliberately placed, not carelessly discarded. I dismissed it as the remnants of day trippers who had too much fun, perhaps deciding to go barefoot for a while. Still, a sense of unease began to creep over me. Pushing the thought aside, I pressed on towards the distant peak. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, forcing me to watch my footing carefully. It was then that I noticed something peculiar in the dirt, strange lines and patterns, almost as if something had been dragged through the earth. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, but they were too uniform, too deliberate. They stretched on for yards, always pointing in the direction of the peak. My initial intrigue turned to a gnawing sense of discomfort as these lines guided me further and further from anything recognizable as a trail. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was some kind of plant feature or the remnants of flash flooding. But nothing quite fit. The only thing that came close were the tracks left by tumbleweeds, but I couldn't spot a single one in the area. My sense of adventure began to wane as I followed these disturbing marks, my footsteps now cautious on the uneven ground. The lines twisted and turned, leading me on a path that seemed to stretch into infinity. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 1.5 miles, I finally spotted movement ahead. The sight made my heart pound with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. I crouched down, using a small rise in the terrain for cover. Peering over the embankment, I saw a scene that would haunt me for years to come. In the distance, gathered on a ridgeline, was a group of men. They were dusty and dirty, their clothes tattered and hanging off their gaunt frames. Their faces were obscured by grime and shadows, giving them an otherworldly appearance. They moved with a deliberate, almost ritualistic precision, lifting large concrete blocks over their heads in a repetitive motion. I squinted, trying to make out more details. The blocks seemed to have something written on them, but I was too far away to decipher the words. My pulse quickened as I observed this bizarre spectacle, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The men chanted in unison, their voices a low, droning murmur that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. As they lifted the blocks again and again, I noticed a figure moving among them. Taller and more slender than the others, this person seemed to be some kind of leader. In their hand, they wielded a thin, sharp instrument, a whip, I realized with growing horror. As I watched, frozen in place, the leader struck the backs and chests of the men, drawing blood that glistened in the harsh sunlight. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was witnessing. Was this some kind of cult? A twisted form of punishment? The chanting grew louder, the men's cries of pain piercing the eerie quiet of the wilderness. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I realized the gravity of my situation. I had stumbled upon something I was never meant to see. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this grotesque scene as possible. But fear had rooted me to the spot. I watched, unable to look away, as the men continued their gruesome ritual. Suddenly, a twig snapped beneath my foot. The sound, amplified by the unnatural silence, seemed to echo across the landscape. The leader's head snapped in my direction, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw their eyes lock onto mine. Panic surged through me, breaking the paralysis that had gripped me. I turned and ran, my movements clumsy and frantic. The path back was treacherous, the uneven ground and thick underbrush conspiring against my escape. Branches whipped at my face and arms, leaving stinging welts, but I barely noticed. Behind me, I could still hear the chanting and screaming, the sound seeming to chase me through the forest. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I pushed on, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. Just as I thought I couldn't run another step, I burst out of the thicket and onto the familiar trail. I bent over, hands on my knees, gulping in air. But my relief was short-lived. To my horror, I saw another group of men approaching from further down the trail. They were removing their shoes and shirts, placing them neatly by the side of the path, exactly where I had seen the discarded clothes earlier. They tied ropes around their waists, each rope leading to a cinder block marked with overlapping words I couldn't quite make out. They noticed me, but instead of the reaction I expected, anger, surprise, or aggression, they simply nodded and waved solemnly. Their faces were etched with a grim resolve that chilled me to my core. Without a word, they began their slow, arduous trek towards the mountain peak. As they walked, their ropes pulled tight, and I watched in stunned silence as the cinder blocks dragged through the dirt behind them, leaving those eerie lines I had followed earlier. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as they disappeared into the distance. Their figures grew smaller and smaller against the backdrop of that towering peak until they were swallowed up by the landscape. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, it was over. The forest fell silent once more, the unnatural quiet pressing down around me like a physical weight. I don't remember much about my journey back to the parking lot. My mind was a whirl of confusion, fear, and disbelief. When I finally reached my car, I all but collapsed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove home, the events of the day played on a loop in my mind. What had I witnessed? Who were those men, and what twisted purpose drove their actions? The questions swirled in my head, but I knew I would never seek the answers. I never returned to that trail. The woods, which had once been a refuge from the confines of lockdown, had become a place of haunting memories and unspoken horrors. The men and their strange, painful ritual remained a chilling mystery, one that I had no desire to unravel further. From that day on, I kept to the marked paths and populated areas. My sense of adventure had been replaced by a profound respect for the unknown and a deep-seated fear of what might lie hidden in the wilderness. The isolation of the pandemic no longer seemed so oppressive compared to the terrifying enigma I had encountered. To this day, I can still recall the sounds of the men's cries, the eerie chants, and the haunting silence that followed. It's a memory that refuses to fade, a reminder that some corners of the world are best left unexplored. In the end, it wasn't just the isolation that frightened me, but the realization that sometimes the greatest horrors lie just beyond the safety of the familiar path. As life slowly returned to normal and the pandemic receded, I found myself changed. The world seemed darker, more mysterious, and infinitely more dangerous. But I also felt a strange sense of gratitude. In a time when the greatest threat seemed to be a virus we couldn't see, I had been reminded that there are other, older dangers lurking in the shadows, dangers that no vaccine could protect against. I never spoke to anyone about what I saw that day. Who would believe me? Instead, I carry the secret with me, a burden that weighs heavily on my soul. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself staring out the window towards the distant forests. And I wonder if, somewhere out there, those men are still performing their grim ritual, forever bound to that mysterious peak and the dark purpose it serves. The last bell of the school year had barely stopped ringing before I found myself in the backseat of my parents' car alongside my best friend Zach. We were headed to a week-long summer camp, our bags packed with swimsuits, hiking boots, and enough bug spray to repel a small army of mosquitoes. The excitement was palpable, a whole week of freedom, adventure, and the great outdoors stretched before us. I won't be releasing the name of the camp, for reasons that will become clear. But as we pulled up to the entrance, marked by a weathered wooden sign and flanked by towering pine trees, I felt a mix of anticipation and nervous energy. Parents milled about, hugging their kids goodbye and signing what I assumed were safety waivers. The air was filled with the scent of pine needles and the sound of laughter from kids who had already arrived. Once all the parents had left, we were assigned to our cabins and introduced to our camp leaders. Zach and I were thrilled to learn we'd be in the same cabin, along with 8 other boys our age. Our excitement, however, was tempered when we met our camp leader, Peter. From the moment I laid eyes on him, something about Peter set me on edge. He was in his early 20s, with long, greasy black hair that hung limply around his pale face. His skin was so white it was almost translucent, as if he'd never seen the sun. For someone working at a summer camp, he didn't seem like the outdoorsy type at all. His eyes, when they met mine, seemed to look right through me, and I had to suppress a shudder. Despite my initial misgivings about Peter, the first 2 days of camp were fantastic. Zach and I threw ourselves into every activity with gusto. We went canoeing on the lake, the water sparkling under the summer sun as we raced the other campers. We tried our hands at rock climbing, our muscles burning as we scaled the artificial wall. In the afternoons, we cooled off in the swimming hole, joining in splashing fights and diving competitions. It wasn't all just physical activities, either. We made friendship bracelets in arts and crafts, learned how to identify different types of trees on nature walks, and sang cheesy camp songs around the bonfire at night. We even met 2 girls, Jessie and Erica, who quickly became part of our little group. It was on Wednesday afternoon, around 5:30, when things started to take a turn for the unsettling. Erica and I had wandered off to a beautiful spot by the river, away from the noise and bustle of the main camp. The water gurgled peacefully over smooth stones, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. We sat on a fallen log, talking and laughing. Erica told me about her hometown, a small place I'd never heard of in the next state over. She was on the swim team at her school, she said, and hoped to compete at the state level next year. I shared my own stories, my dreams of making the basketball team, my struggles with algebra, the time I'd broken my arm trying to do a trick on my skateboard. Erica had just started telling me about her grandparents' cabin, which was apparently not far from the camp, when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Standing just a little way up the path we'd taken to get here was Peter. He wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at us. I raised my hand in an awkward wave, hoping he'd say something or wave back or do anything other than just stand there. But he remained motionless, his eyes fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Erica noticed my discomfort and followed my gaze. When she saw Peter, she visibly stiffened. "Hey," she whispered, her voice tight with unease, "can we go somewhere else?" I nodded, grateful for the excuse to leave. As we walked away, I couldn't help but look back over my shoulder. Peter was still there, still watching, still unnaturally still. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickened my pace. Later that night, our cabin was in the lodge for dinner. The air was filled with the smell of cooking food and the chatter of excited campers recounting their day's adventures. I scanned the room, looking for Peter, but he was nowhere to be seen. "Hey, Zach," I said, leaning across the table, "have you seen Peter?" Zach shook his head, his mouth full of mashed potatoes. He swallowed and asked, "Why? What's up?" I told him about the incident by the river, how Peter had just stood there, staring at me and Erica. Zach listened, his brow furrowing as I spoke. "That is weird," he admitted when I'd finished. "But maybe you're overreacting a bit. He could have been doing something else and just didn't hear you." I wanted to believe Zach was right, that I was making a big deal out of nothing. But I couldn't shake the memory of Peter's unblinking stare, the way he'd remained so unnaturally still. If he'd been doing something else, why didn't he wave back? Why didn't he move at all? Just as these thoughts were swirling through my mind, Peter walked into the lodge. My stomach dropped as he made his way over to our table and sat down directly across from me. He started chatting with some of the other boys, his voice jovial and light, as if nothing was wrong. I kept my eyes fixed on my plate, not wanting to make eye contact. Every time he spoke, I felt a chill run through me. That night, I tossed and turned in my bunk, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. It must have been well past midnight when I woke up with an urgent need to use the bathroom. We weren't supposed to go out alone at night, but everyone else seemed to be fast asleep. I debated waking Zach, but decided against it. It was just a quick trip to the bathroom, after all. What could go wrong? I slipped on my flip-flops and made my way out of the cabin, trying to be as quiet as possible. The night was cool and still, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The bathroom was in a separate building, just a short walk from our cabin. As I pushed open the door, I wrinkled my nose at the smell. The camp bathrooms were never the cleanest, but at night they seemed even worse. I found the least disgusting stall and went about my business, trying to be quick. That's when I heard it, the sound of the bathroom door opening and closing. Footsteps echoed on the tiled floor, coming closer and closer to my stall. I held my breath, telling myself it was probably just another camper, maybe someone from a different cabin. The footsteps stopped right outside my stall. Through the gap at the bottom of the door, I could see a pair of feet. They just stood there, not moving, not entering another stall. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever it was must be able to hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the feet moved away, towards the exit. I started to relax, thinking they were leaving. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The bathroom door slammed shut with a bang that made me jump. In the pitch darkness, I heard the footsteps returning, slow and deliberate. They stopped outside my stall again. I was trembling now, fear coursing through every vein in my body. "Is anyone there?" I managed to croak out, my voice shaky and weak. There was no response. Just silence. Then, suddenly, I felt something. A cold hand, grabbing my leg through the gap under the stall door. I screamed, louder than I've ever screamed in my life. Pure terror gave me strength I didn't know I had. I kicked out, slamming the stall door open, and ran. I didn't look back, didn't think, just ran as fast as I could. But curiosity got the better of me. As I reached the bathroom door, I glanced over my shoulder. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. Peter was chasing after me, his long hair wild, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. But that wasn't the worst part. He was wearing one of my shirts, a shirt I brought to camp, a shirt that should have been in my bag in the cabin. And even more horrifying, he was wearing a pair of my underwear. I ran faster than I've ever run before, My lungs were burning, my bare feet slapping against the ground, but I didn't slow down. I made for the lodge, praying it would be open, praying there would be someone there. To my immense relief, the lights were on in the lodge. I burst through the door to find two of the other camp leaders sitting at a table, talking and eating chips. They looked up in shock as I came crashing in. "What's wrong?" one of them asked, jumping to her feet. Between gasps for air, I managed to tell them about Peter, about what had happened in the bathroom, about him wearing my clothes. Their faces grew more and more concerned as I spoke. One of them picked up a phone and made a call while the other sat me down, got me a glass of water, and told me I could stay in a spare room in the lodge for the night. I was too shaken to ask questions, too relieved to be safe to wonder what was going to happen next. The next morning, my parents arrived to pick me up. The camp must have called them, though no one told me exactly what had been said. I didn't care. I was just happy to be leaving, to be going home where I felt safe. A week later, I got a call from Zach. He told me that Peter had never returned to the cabin that night. In fact, he wasn't found anywhere on the campgrounds. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I don't know what happened to Peter. I don't know why he was so fixated on me, or how he got my clothes, or what he planned to do if he had caught me in that bathroom. And to be honest, I don't want to know. What I do know is this: I will never stay at an overnight camp again. The memory of Peter's face in the darkness, wearing my clothes, chasing after me, it's enough to make me swear off camping for life. So if you're planning on going to summer camp, just be careful. Be aware of your surroundings. And if something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. You never know what or who might be lurking in the shadows. The summer I turned 24, I landed a gig as a ranger in Red Lodge State Park out in Minnesota. Fresh out of college and eager for adventure, I figured the quiet woods would be a nice change of pace from the bustling streets of New York where I grew up. My buddy Vance had done the same thing a few years back, and he painted a pretty picture of lazy days and breathtaking scenery. "It's a whole lot of nothing," he'd said with a grin, "but it's beautiful nothing." That sounded perfect to me. I was assigned the south stretch of the park, a good 30 miles of trails, picnic areas, and campgrounds. It was a lot of ground to cover, but I was young and full of energy. Plus, I had my trusty patrol truck to help me get around. Those first few weeks, Vance's description proved spot on. I spent most of my days driving around, tidying up campsites, and waving at the occasional hiker. The air was clean, the views were spectacular, and the quiet was so profound it almost felt like a physical presence. It was peaceful. Almost dull, really. Maybe that's why when things went sideways, it took me by complete surprise. It started with some missing person reports. Nothing unusual at first glance. Folks wander off all the time in places like this, especially city slickers who underestimate the vastness of the wilderness. Still, protocol is protocol. So I made my rounds, chatting up campers about any strangers they might have seen, any odd occurrences. That's how I met Eleanor, a spry old gal with an airstream and a suspicious demeanor that could put a detective to shame. We got to talking, and she mentioned hearing strange noises at night. "Not an animal, I know them calls," she'd said, squinting up at the trails that disappeared into the dense forest. "Something bigger. Something wrong." I'll admit, I chalked it up to her imagination at first. When you're alone in the woods at night, it's easy for the mind to play tricks on you. But something in the way she said it, the conviction in her voice, made me uneasy. I made a mental note to be more watchful around those parts of the park. A few days later, the radio crackled to life as I was doing my usual rounds. It was HQ, and their news sent a chill down my spine. Another hiker had vanished. They wanted me to do a sweep, focusing on the south end where Eleanor had mentioned the sounds. Suddenly, that peaceful dullness didn't feel so comforting anymore. I rolled up to the designated starting point, radio at my hip, and set out on foot. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows through the trees and making the woods look all shadowy and unsettling. I kept expecting to find a lost kid or a grumpy retiree who'd wandered off the trail, but all the paths turned up empty. Eleanor's words about strange noises played on repeat in my head, making every rustle of leaves sound monstrous. Man, Vance never mentioned being this easy to spook out here. The further I got, the colder it felt, and not just because the light was fading. It was like the air itself sat heavier here, pressing down on me with an almost physical weight. The trees seemed to loom larger, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I shook my head, trying to clear away the fanciful thoughts. I was here to do a job, not get spooked by my own imagination. That's why I saw it. A flash of movement deeper in the trees, just at the edge of my vision. I froze, heart suddenly pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the oppressive silence of the forest. "Anyone there?" No one answered. The woods seemed to hold its breath, waiting. My heart drummed a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I didn't like the looks of this, not one bit. With trembling fingers, I unclipped the radio from my belt. "HQ, this is Ranger Callahan. Possible sign of the missing hiker in sector." Before I could finish my report, the thing stepped out into the dusky light. Lord, I wish I could unsee it. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with wiry limbs that looked too long for its body, all twisted and wrong. But its head, that was the worst part. Bulbous and misshapen, with skin pulled tight like something rotting beneath. There were no eyes, just smooth, pale skin where eyes should be. Only slits for a nose, and a gash of a mouth that hung wide open, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It let out a screech that pierced my ears, a sound I can't even begin to describe. It was like metal tearing, like 1,000 nails on a chalkboard, like the death cry of something that should never have existed. Fear shot white-hot through my veins, turning my blood to ice. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen or heard of in all my years of studying wildlife. I fumbled for my sidearm, fingers trembling as I tried to line up a shot. "HQ," I gasped into the radio, my voice barely above a whisper. "Shots fired. Shots fired at." The creature lunged, and it was fast, inhumanly fast. One moment it was yards away, the next it was on me. The gun flew out of my hand as I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I rolled, barely avoiding a swipe of its impossibly long claws. They raked the earth where I'd been lying, leaving deep gouges in the soil. My heart hammered like it was about to leap out of my chest. I scrambled back, trying to put space between us, the forest blurring around me as panic took hold. I needed to radio for help, but where was the damn thing? I whipped my head around, searching the trees frantically. It could be anywhere, and there. I spotted it slinking across the branches like some sort of warped spider, its limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. It screeched again, that awful sound that cut right through me, and leaped. Time seemed to slow. My mouth opened to scream, but all that came out was a choked gasp as the weight of the creature crashed into my chest. The impact sent me flying. My arm slammed into a tree trunk hard enough to make my teeth rattle, and pain exploded through my shoulder. But there was no time to dwell on it. I could hear that terrible screech echoing behind me, getting closer. Adrenaline surged through me, masking the pain as I stumbled to my feet and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, tearing at my clothes and skin. It didn't matter. Pain was temporary. Getting eaten wasn't. My lungs were screaming for air, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear it behind me, that unnatural rustling, the snap of branches under its weight. I burst out into a clearing and skidded to a halt, nearly falling over my own feet. There, in the center of the open space, stood an old fire tower. It was rusty and skeletal, looking like it hadn't been used in years, but it was high. If I could climb it, maybe I could get a signal on the radio, call for backup. It was my only shot. I sprinted towards it, the metal ladder runs cold beneath my battered hands. Scrambling up felt agonizingly slow, my movements clumsy with terror clawing at my throat. "Don't look down, don't look down," I chanted in my head, but of course, I did. The creature was below, circling the base of the tower. Those spindly limbs twitched as it regarded me with that empty-eyed stare. My stomach lurched, but I forced myself to keep climbing. Nearly at the top, I risked another glance down. Through the trees, I could see my patrol truck, just a little speck in the distance. If I could just get to it, to the more powerful radio inside. I was almost there, my fingers desperately grasping for the last rung when the tower gave a sickening lurch. One of the rusted support beams groaned, then snapped with a horrible metallic shriek. The whole structure tilted, slow at first, and then with terrifying speed. My scream got cut short as the ground rushed up to meet me. Pain exploded in my leg, white-hot and all-consuming. The last thing I saw before blackness swallowed me whole was that creature, looming over me, its mouth open wide in a silent scream. I woke up in the hospital, groggy and confused. A nurse with kind eyes and a gentle touch told me some hikers had stumbled across me, unconscious but lucky to be alive. Broken leg, mild concussion, and one hell of a story, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. But when I tried to explain what had happened, the words stuck in my throat. It sounded too wild, too impossible, even to my own ears. The other park rangers who came to visit gave me sympathetic looks, said I must have been in shock. Maybe they were right. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, conjured up some monster to explain a simple fall. That part was sadly unsurprising. Rangers get hurt all the time out in the wilderness. But what I saw out there... I've worked in forests my whole life, seen all manner of critters. That thing wasn't any bear or bobcat I've ever heard of. It wasn't anything of this world. Eleanor, bless her nosy soul, came to visit. She brought me a pie and a whole lot of I told you so energy. Turns out she had a run-in with the creature too, right around the time she reported those noises. It had snatched one of her chickens and vanished back into the trees before she could get a good look at it. We never saw it again after that night. The reports of missing folks stopped too. Whatever it was, it seemed to have moved on or found its fill. The park never officially reopened that trail. Unsafe conditions, the signs say. Fine by me. I've had my fill of unsafe conditions to last a lifetime. Vance called when he heard what happened, joked about me finally getting some excitement in my ranger career. I didn't find it so funny. They offered my old job back, of course. Said they needed experienced people after the whole incident. I turned them down, told them I'd taken a shine to the quiet indoors. They looked at me like I was nuts, considering how much I'd loved the job before. But they didn't understand. They hadn't seen what I'd seen. Sometimes, late at night, I still think I hear that screech, high and wrong, like a nail dragged across glass. The doctors blamed it on tinnitus, some nerve damage from the fall. Maybe they're right. But I know what I heard, what I saw. I started calling it the rake, because of the way it looked all twisted and hunched, and because of those terrible claws that had nearly taken my life. It seems as good a name as any for a monster you can't prove exists. But I know it's out there, somewhere in those deep, dark woods. And I hope to God I never see it again.